So Jeff has a lot of insight to provide us with. First, about why the FTC is suing Southern Glazers at all and kind of the state of consolidation in the second tier, the alcohol industry. Second, can the FTC win given not only the current political environment, but the idea in the US that big is not bad? So, something that has kind of always been true. And then third, what actually happens if the FTC wins their lawsuit? Welcome to Masterclass US Wine Market with me, Barbara Fitzgerald. In this show, we'll break down the complexities of selling wine in the US by discussing the relevant issues of today with experts from around the globe. Each episode serves up 3 key insights to help elevate your winery's presence in the US market. So grab a pen and paper and let's pave the way for your success in the US. Hello and welcome to Masterclass US Wine Market. Today, I am thrilled to welcome Jeff Siegel to the show. Jeff Siegel is known as the Wine Curmudgeon. He is a wine critic, writer, speaker, and as well as the author of The Wine Curmudgeon's Guide to Cheap Wine. He has taught about wine and beverage management at Dallas College and the Cordon Bleu in Dallas, and is the co-founder and former president of Drink Local Wine, the first locavore wine movement. So welcome to the show, Jeff. It's really nice to have you here.
Well, thank you, Barbara. It's a real pleasure. I've been looking forward to doing it.
Great. Thank you. And before we dive into today's discussion, can you tell us a little bit more about your background and how you came to work in the wine business?
Well, I have one of those backwards wine stories. I'm a cranky ex-newspaper reporter who worked for 4 newspapers, 3 of which no longer exist. And I decided I needed to try to find something else to do. And when writing books didn't work out, I ended up writing about wine, starting out writing consumer wine for a couple of newspapers in the Dallas area, and then eventually got into the trade side of it because to me, it's a little more interesting than writing toasty and hokey all the time. And for 17 years, I had a blog called The Wine Curmudgeon in which I focused on wine people could afford to buy, which of course is called cheap wine, which the industry hates. And of course, over the last 15 years, they hate cheap wine even more than they used to.
Yes, maybe we can rebrand it affordable wine because who doesn't love that?
I tried that too. And it didn't work.
Well, again, we're really happy to have you here. So what we're going to talk about today is really the recent FTC lawsuit against Southern Glazers Wine and Spirits, which alleges discriminatory pricing practices that really create a disadvantage for smaller retailers, but also presents a really multifaceted issue with significant implications for antitrust enforcement and alcohol distribution. So Jeff has been a key industry reporter on this issue and has a lot of insight to provide us with. So in this episode, we're really excited to learn from him first about why the FTC is suing Southern Glazers at all and kind of the state of consolidation in the second tier, the alcohol industry. Second, can the FTC win given not only the current political environment, but the idea in the US that big is not bad? So something that has kind of always been true. And then third, what actually happens if the FTC wins their lawsuit? So let's dive in.
Well, I just want to preface this by saying I'm not an attorney, although my mother desperately still wants me to be one. So in that respect, I'm talking as an educated and informed reporter who's been covering this for way longer than I care to admit. Especially for non-Americans and even some Americans, the idea of a wholesaler is in the U.S. is not just somebody who, if you're a small retailer, you can buy a couple of pallets of wine from. It's the law. Everybody from the biggest retailer to the smallest retailer, from the biggest restaurant chain to the local restaurant down the corner, everybody's got to buy wine through a wholesaler.
Right. There's no way to avoid this having contact.
There's no way. And so before we talk about this, one of my favorite numbers in 1995, at the beginning of the U.S. wine boom, there were about 1,800 U.S. wineries and about 3,000 wholesalers. 1,800 wineries, 3,000 wholesalers.
It's a good balance back then. Where are we now?
At the end of 2024, there are about 12,000 wineries, give or take, and fewer than 1,000 wholesalers.
And you're just talking about U.S. wineries, and those wholesalers are also looking at a global market.
Yeah. So in other words, the number of wholesalers has declined by 2/3. And in the US, the number of wineries has increased sixfold.
Yeah. So we're in a really now disproportionate environment.
And to make it even more difficult for people to understand, the two biggest wholesalers control about half of the US wholesale market, and the top 10 control about 80%.
Right. And important, I think, to also call out that it's not that wholesalers have been going out of business. It's been massive consolidation. So these bigger brands are buying smaller wholesalers.
Exactly. And in fact, just for this recording this podcast today, Southern Glazers, who's being sued by the FTC and is the biggest wholesaler, announced that they had closed their deal of Horizon Beverage, which was one of the top 10 wholesalers in the United States and was a very important wholesaler in New England.
Wow.
So your top 10 biggest wholesalers in the U.S. today only has 9.
Right.
Because Southern bought one of the top 10.
Well, I think that's a really good segue then into our conversation. So you mentioned that we've seen significant consolidation in the US alcohol distribution industry since the early 1990s. What do you think really pushed the FTC to take action against Southern Glazers now? And why does this case matter for the broader market?
I think it happened now for what the main reason it happened now is they wanted to get the suit filed before the new presidential administration comes in, which doesn't believe in government regulation. That, I think, is the reason it would happen now. Having said that, they've been working on it for at least a couple of years, and there were a bunch of reports this summer in June, I believe, that the FTC was ready to sue Southern Glazers at that time. They held off until now, I think, to get all their I's dotted and their T's crossed and so forth. But the Biden administration has said that consolidation throughout U.S. industry is too big. It particularly singled out alcohol beverage. It particularly singled out, oddly enough, the beer business, because there are, as I always like to say, there are only really 1.5 beer companies in the United States, depending on how you count the 2 beer companies, because they're got these weird intermingling corporate relationships.
Right.
But the government has been looking at the second tier for a while. And as far as I've been told, there also seems to be an ongoing Internal Revenue Service investigation and a Tax and Trade Bureau investigation. The TTB is the federal agency that regulates alcohol beverage in the U.S. of Southern Glazers, which has nothing to do with the FTC investigation, the FTC lawsuit.
So there's a lot going on for Southern. Aren't they also part currently of a private antitrust lawsuit as well?
Yeah. In fact, if it was anybody but Southern, they'd probably be worried about it. They're being sued by a smaller technically not a wholesaler, but a company that offers an e-commerce platform so that if I'm a small retailer, I can go to this independent e-commerce platform and order from all of the major wholesalers, and I don't have to have 6 apps on my phone to order. And apparently, Provi, I believe, is the e-commerce provider. They're suing Southern Glazers because they said Southern's trying to block them from using their e-commerce platform. So yeah, I'm old enough that I remember when the federal government sued companies for antitrust violations, which basically really hasn't happened in the last 20, 25 years. I may be off a little bit on the dates, but as we've talked about at the top of the show, in the United States, and especially in the last 20, 25 years, big is good, and there's nothing wrong with being big. And I wrote a story for Meiningers earlier this year about the latest round of wholesale consolidation. Mm-hmm. And every single analyst I talked to said the wholesalers have to get bigger. It's the only way they're going to make money. Mm-hmm. And I found that absolutely fascinating. How much bigger can they get?
Yeah. Well, that's another good segue. So let's put a pin for just a moment in the kind of legal woes side of the conversation. But in terms of the consolidation and the size, Southern Glazers, they distribute, from my understanding, 1 out of every 3 bottles of wine and spirits sold in the US. So how has this level of consolidation kind of shaped competition? And do you think it poses unique challenges for the regulators?
I think to understand how big Southern Glazers is, the 1 out of 3 is a really good number. But the other thing to keep in mind is that up until 15 years ago, 20 years ago, there were no national wholesalers in the United States. They were almost all regional, and there were still local. When I started in Dallas writing about wine in the late 90s, there were still, a half a dozen regional, powerful wholesalers. that are now almost all gone. And they've been bought up first by Glazers, and then when Glazers and Southern did their business deal, now they're part of Southern. So this idea that we have to get bigger, we have to get bigger, we have to get bigger. The argument is, if somebody's big, they have more economies of scale and more efficiencies so that they can offer better prices to the consumer. And my point of argument with that is, then why do we have antitrust laws? And why do we believe in the free market? Right. If we're going to have a system, and I think this is the gist of the FTC's, the heart of the FTC's lawsuit. If we're going to have a system in the United States which venerates, which honors, which gets down and kneels at the statue of free enterprise, which we supposedly do, then why don't we have free enterprise in wholesale alcohol distribution?
Right. It's a good question.
And I think that's kind of what the FTC was looking into. And depending on who you talk to, and it's very difficult to get anybody to say this on the record because they're all terrified. I've got a friend who's a wine marketer, and this wine marketer said, I'd be happy to go with you. All of the things that I know that Southern Glazers, and to a lesser extent, other wholesalers who are not part of the lawsuit, have done in terms of discriminatory pricing, in terms of you can have this brand, but you can't have this brand because we're saving it for somebody else, all of which are theoretically illegal.
Right. Yeah. But like you said, we just don't have a good record of that. It would take a whistleblower, I guess.
It would take a whistleblower, and because of the consolidation, and if I'm a marketer, if I'm a retailer, I can't complain, because if I complain, they're all terrified they'll be punished by the wholesalers.
Right.
And because the wholesalers, by law, they need the wholesalers, so they can't get any product.
So they're kind of wedged in this tight spot for sharing this information with us.
Exactly.
Well, so the FTC lawsuit was filed under the Robinson-Patman Act, which has been called a sleeping giant of antitrust law. So as you mentioned earlier, hasn't really been enacted in almost 25 years. So why do you think the sleeping giant is being waken up now? And what makes this case against Southern Glazers the catalyst?
I think there's a couple of things here. I think it's the Wright-Patman. I keep calling it Wright-Patman again. I'm showing my age. Wright-Patman Air Force Base in, I believe, in Dayton. Robinson-Patman specifically addresses unfair pricing. So if you look at the wholesale alcohol business and you see that, as the FTC said, Southern Glazers is offering discounts that are not economically legitimate. They're offering economic discounts in terms of volume discounts, in terms of other things, to favor their best customers, because they would rather sell to their best customers than sell to the man or the woman down the street who they're only going to sell a case of wine to instead of 3 trainloads of. And if you look at it, that makes perfect sense. If I have a $26 billion business, as Southern Glazers did, I'm certainly rather want to go sell to Costco or to Kroger or to Total Wine than I am to Jeff Siegel's cheap wine and spirits down the street, where I'm only going to have a couple of hundred SKUs.
Right. And so this seems also, though, to be kind of the FTC under the Biden administration signaling this broader crackdown on anti-competitive practices, also evidenced by the block of Kroger's acquisition of Albertsons. But this was an actual lawsuit. So do you think that this suit is a one-off, or maybe do you see it as part of a bigger effort to rein in consolidation across all industries, not necessarily just alcohol distribution?
I think if Kamala Harris had won the election, I think it would be the first shot in an ongoing campaign against consolidation. I talked to a couple of lawyers over the last several years about all this. I actually talked to a lot of attorneys about this stuff. And one of them said that he doesn't understand what took the government so long. And this guy's really, really smart. He's a former state alcohol official. And he said, the federal government had for years and years and years all of these tools if the federal government wanted to try to slow consolidation, not just on the wholesale side, but on the producer side and on the retail side. And that now they're doing it shows that they actually have taken the time, because it is complicated. Antitrust law is incredibly complicated. You ask attorneys that, and they'll tell you it's some of the most complicated law there is. And if it took 4 years for the FTC to figure out this case against Southern Glazers, it's because it is that complicated.
Right. Multifaceted, for sure.
That's a much better word, multifaceted. I like.
Let's talk a little bit about what this means also, for consumers. So there are critics of the suit that argue enforcing laws like Robinson Patman could drive up prices for consumers, while the supporters of the suit claim it's really essential to tackle this corporate consolidation. So, how do you see this tension kind of playing out?
As I noted before, this whole pricing thing to me is foolish. Either we have free enterprise or we don't have free enterprise. And if we have free enterprise, then competition lowers prices. So the idea that we have to have monopolies to have low prices seems to me to be counterintuitive, counterproductive, and kind of silly. That's number one. Number two, I think the FTC, and its job is to promote competition and to make sure there's a healthy marketplace. If you look at the wine business, there's not a healthy marketplace. It's more and more difficult. You talk to any small retailer, and even allowing for the fact that small retailers sometimes might exaggerate about how difficult business might be, but it's harder for them to get merchandise. It's harder for them to have stuff that they want. I talk to retailers all the time, and even if they have a successful business and they've been around for 20 and 30 years, they'll tell you the same thing. It's just difficult to get anybody but smaller wholesalers to deal with us, and then they don't have the products that consumers want. Consumers want Kendall Jackson wine. You and I can sit here and wonder why they might, or might wonder why they might want a product from Gallo or a product from Delicato, but that's what they want. That's what they buy. And if the pricing is such that it's $8.99 at Kroger, which is a national grocery store chain under a dozen different banners, as they call them in the supermarket business, if it's $8.99 at Kroger and $14.99 at Jeff's Wine and Spirits down the street, well, I'm not going to sell any bottles of it.
Right, right. And I think it's important, definitely what this does for, consumers, but I think it's also important to talk about how this consolidation affects producers as well, because the small producers are suddenly, existing on the same books as Gallo and Delicato and KJ, and they're getting lost. So we're not just losing our ability to provide consumers with choices, we're losing the choices.
And we're losing the choices because, to go back to that number from 1995, with whatever it was, 1,200 wineries and 3,000 wholesalers, that meant that if I was a winery and I made enough wine and I wanted to be in retail and I wanted to be in restaurants, there was a wholesaler somewhere who would take me. Now, with 12,000 wineries and 1,000 wholesalers, that means that if I want to sell my wine retail or sell my wine in a restaurant, it will be almost impossible. And then you're cutting consumer choice.
Right.
The other thing I think that's really important here is that if you talk to producers and you talk to their marketing people, they will tell you that the biggest wholesalers sometimes just have brands so the other big wholesalers can't have them. They have no interest in selling these brands. They just keep them on their list so that the other wholesalers can't have them. And again, I'm emphasizing no one will say this on the record because they don't want to be dropped. But I hear enough of it that I think there must be some truth to it.
Right. Yeah. Well, let's also talk a little bit kind of, anyone that does any kind of trade in the US, I'm sure is very curious, concerned about what's going to happen in 10 days and what that means for our markets and our trade. But what do you think the political and kind of administrative changes are going to mean to the enforcement of antitrust laws like these?
Well, at the news conference, the FTC officials who held a news conference to announce this, which I was so excited I got to watch, just like a real reporter, right?
Wow.
Said that in the history of the FTC, there had almost never been an investigation stopped by an incoming administration. That had almost never happened. So, allowing for the uniqueness of the new incoming administration, we can just assume that the suit will go forward. And in one respect, I think it may very well go forward because I think the incoming Trump administration has a whole lot more things to worry about than this, according to what they think they need to do to make America, a fine place for people to live again. I'll try not to be too sarcastic there. I'll try to be more objective next time I say that. So there's a pretty good chance. I'd say there's a pretty good chance it goes forward. Whether the FTC can win or not, I'm not an attorney, and it's antitrust law, so even if I was an attorney, I'd be confused. But the attorneys I've talked to have said, if you can prove that it's not a legitimate volume discount, if you can prove it's a volume discount because you want to only serve the best customers and screw the small retailers, then I think they've got a chance of winning. And from the news conference, that's what the FTC officials told us. The other thing, Barbara, that's really important to understand here is that the federal government traditionally outside of the Treasury Department and the Tax and Trade Bureau, which regulates alcohol. The rest of the federal government has a very unclear idea of how the three-tier system works.
Right.
We saw this with the tariffs under the first Trump administration, in which they thought they were punishing the French and to a lesser extent the Spanish by making their wine more expensive and forcing the French to pay the tariff. And in fact, the tariffs were paid by American businesses,
Right.
the importers, and to a lesser extent, the wholesalers and the retailers. So I think the FTC took a long time to understand how the three-tier system works. And that may be to their advantage as they go into this lawsuit. I think they do understand the questions that they answered and the way they answered them during the news conference showed that I think they did figure out how the three-tier system works and what they need to do to make this lawsuit successful.
Yeah, that's a good call out though, that, it is a complicated system that if you're not spending people do spend their lives in the three-tier system and still, there's questions. So if that's not what you're doing day in, day out, it's why this podcast exists, trying to break down the complexities. Well, let's imagine that the FTC does win this case. What changes would you expect in alcohol distribution? And do you think it could genuinely help small retailers, or could there be unintended consequences?
I think if the FTC wins, and by winning in this case, I think it's to Southern Glazer's advantage to settle. I don't think they want their business practices in open court. Every attorney I've talked to, every person in the wine business I've talked to has said they don't want that. So let's assume they're going to be rational and settle, and let's assume that the FTC decides, yes, let's settle. That's the best we can do here. And then there'll be whatever they call it, some sort of consent agreement in which Southern will promise not to offer these unfair discounts anymore. And yes, it's one thing to offer a volume discount to Kroger, but they've got to be fair about how they do it. And that would be a standard that all the other big wholesalers would have to go by, or then the FTC could sue them. Mm-hmm. I've talked to a lot of people, again, who are concerned that the FTC should sue everybody now. If they get Southern, they should start in on Republic, RNDC, and all the rest. Obviously, that's not going to happen. But if there's a precedent, and if there's a settlement, and Southern, while doing the famous "we admit to no wrongdoing, but we won't do these things anymore," I think that's a precedent for other wholesalers. In the end, it can only benefit small retailers because they will be able to carry products that their customers want that won't cost 1/3, 1/4, 1/5 more.
Yeah. So you don't agree with the naysayers that say this could lead to price hikes for consumers?
Let me just say this about price hikes. All right. I'm a freelance writer. I work in one of the most competitive environments in the world, probably next to acting and music, in which people will work for free because they need the exposure. I know all about the free market. I know all about pricing and all of that. And if anybody tells me that breaking up big monopolies that hold my wages down is going to hold that, is going to raise prices, I think they're crazy. I think they're looking at it from the perspective of, in the United States, consolidation is good, and we need more big companies.
Right.
And to be perfectly honest, I understand that. I want a big company and I want to make money. I want to have as few employees as possible. I want to have as much of it digital as possible. And a way to do that is to work with companies equally as big as I am. And that way I'll make more money. I understand that. I don't know that it's legal because, again, I'm not an attorney, but I do understand it.
Well, I think you've already talked about it in a few ways, but this case really highlights the struggle of smaller retailers, which we know that this is a difficult industry to be in, especially at the moment. And then the fact that they're trying to compete with these giants like Costco. And we hear small retailers really talk about personal impact, like of unfair competition, like stores closing and communities losing a gathering spot. But do you think that actions like this lawsuit can level the playing field, or is there really a deeper issue that needs to be addressed?
I'm going to tell you this because I think this is maybe getting to the heart of the matter with this. The wine business is in big, serious trouble. And everybody who thinks it isn't needs to go stop drinking or smoking or whatever it is that they're doing. It's in big, serious trouble. How do we get people to drink wine again? Do we get it by sending them to Costco? Do we get by sending them to Kroger? Do we get by sending them to Total Wine, where all they do is stare at the wall, the legendary, the infamous Great Wall of Wine in the supermarket, and confuse the crap out of them? and they have no idea what to buy? Or do we bring people back into the wine business by sending them to Jeff's Wine and Spirits down the street, where they can say to Jeff, I want to buy a $12 wine that's not too tart and doesn't have that ashy flavor in the back of the mouth, and it has to be red. Do you have something like that? Barbara, which do you think is better for the wine business?
Yeah.
Not for the biggest wholesalers, not for the biggest producers, but for everybody, all 12,000 producers in the wine business.
Yes, absolutely. I think there's been some recent Wine Market Council research that even came out. They were looking specifically at younger consumers, but about how daunting like a chain wine wall or wine section is, because you don't have really the kind of assistance and that connection to help you understand what it is you're looking for and how to find it.
It's so confusing now. Even when I go to Kroger, because I'm also famous as a wine writer who actually goes into stores and shops for wine, all sorts of stores. Even when I go in there, I'm confused because they don't have it in any, legitimate way, shape, or form. Maybe they'll have Chardonnay here, maybe they'll have sweet white wine over here. They've also apparently gotten rid of the country designations, so they got all the Cabernets from all over the world in one place.
Right. Yeah. Well, as we start to kind of wind things down a little bit, first, I just want to say thank you again for all of these insights, because they are so helpful in just helping people understand what's going on. But as we wrap up, we shift to our rapid fire quiz, where we ask our guest 3 questions to help our listeners better understand the U.S. market, and specifically this episode. So just answer, please, in a couple sentences if you can.
Sure.
But what is your number 1 tip for mastering the U.S. wine market?
Mastering the U.S. wine market, number 1 tip is it's incredibly complicated. You can't do it yourself. You're going to have somebody who's familiar with it explain it to you.
Good advice. So maybe a consultant or a great, distribution team here that you can really rely on.
Exactly.
What is something you would have told your younger professional self about selling wine in the U.S.?
I never realized that quantity mattered as much as it does. And I was always under the impression, because everybody paid lip service to quality, but the older I get, and I guess the crankier and more cynical I get, it's all about pallets of wine. How many pallets of wine can we move? And that's both sad and I guess not surprising.
But I think maybe the silver lining is it's hard to categorize quality, right? Like we have different taste preferences, and what I think is fantastic, somebody else might think is not. So
no, and that's a very good point. But in the end, I think it's easier to sell pallets of wine and not worry about the quality.
That is true. What is your favorite travel hack when doing market work or even traveling for articles?
Oh, I don't travel anymore. I'm done with it. That's my advice. Stay home. I went to Amsterdam to judge a wine competition in 2019, just before the pandemic, and it was absolutely brutal. The trip was brutal. The connections were brutal. And I wanted to go to Amsterdam, and I had a good time judging in Amsterdam. And I got to stay at the John Lennon Yoko Ono Hotel in Amsterdam.
Wow.
But it was such that it just reminded me that now that I don't have to do it like I used to have to travel once a month. I'm happy not to do it.
Yeah. Well, good. I'm glad that you get to build the work style that works for you. That's the nice thing about this modern age, right?
Exactly.
Well, Jeff, again, thank you so much for joining us today on Masterclass U.S. Wine Market. This is a very obviously relevant issue, as we mentioned many times, so multifaceted. So hopefully this helps people better understand just what's going on and what it means. But also, how can our listeners connect with you if they have more questions or want to read more of your articles?
Well, if they want to read more of the articles, you can always check Meiningers. I'm a regular there. You can always check Wine Industry Advisor, Wine Industry Network. I'm a regular there, and I've pretty much given up on social media, but I'm still on LinkedIn. So just don't ask me for information about how to get into the U.S. wine market, which oddly enough, I get a lot of requests from people asking how to do that.
Yes, good to know. Good to know. That's not your area of expertise. Well, thank you again so much for joining us. I hope to connect with you again really soon.
My pleasure, and it was really enjoyable. I'm happy to help.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
And that's a wrap for this episode of Masterclass US Wine Market. Thank you so much for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode and want to stay up to date with the latest industry trends, remember to like, follow, and share our podcast. And if you find value in our conversations, please leave us a review to help others discover the show and grow our community. Stay tuned for new episodes every Monday. Until then, brindiamo il vostro successo.